Welcome back to Module 2, Rebuilding Ohio. Today we will discuss how, during the mid-19th century, Ohioans participated in a global movement to reform a world that they had played a crucial role in creating. A world in which Ohio pork fed slaves in Mississippi who harvested cotton that was sent to textile mills in England, which was then sold to the world as a comfortable shirt. The foundations of this capitalistic, technological, and interconnected world was a callous disregard for the humanity of several million slaves. Ohioans, thinking globally but acting locally, focused their efforts on their part of the global chain, the pan-Mississippian world of the mid-19th century. Ohioans participated in a reform movement that we call International Liberalism. Liberalism here doesn't refer to the 21st century governing philosophy of the Democratic Party in the United States. Rather, liberalism was a reform movement to liberate people from the institutions, the traditions, and ideas that shackled them. In particular, international liberalism was a series of movements in the mid-19th century to reform corrupt, unrepresentative governments. People challenged established authorities in Europe and South America, North America, and Asia too, and they often relied on violence to accomplish their political ends. For example, in between 1840 and 1880, 177 wars took place, killing millions upon millions of people. In the United States, we have the example of the Civil War, where the Union fought to liberate 4 million people from the shackles of slavery. Over 600,000 people were killed in that war. In China, from 1850 to 1864, 23 million people were killed in a war there where people rebelled against established authorities. In Ohio, the stakes of reform ranged from local mundane issues to global profound issues. From 1851 to 1852, Ohioans rewrote their constitution. The state's original constitution, ratified in 1803, had created a powerful legislature, so powerful that it could grant special privileges to businesses or individuals. This new constitution banned that privilege. What had motivated this particular reform? The so-called Plunder Law of 1837. Its real name was the Loan Law, but opponents successfully rebranded it as the Plunder Law. Here's why. The loan law was designed to allow companies to apply for a loan to help pay for the construction of canals in Ohio. In reality, most of the money went to companies that built railroad lines, and the railroad companies had lobbied hard and cultivated special relationships with legislators. And the loan law, while spurring the development of railroads, emptied the state's coffers. The state had to borrow money just to pay the interest on these loans. In addition, the state government went into businesses with several private transportation companies and had to cover the costs when these businesses failed. Ohioans also changed their constitution to give more power to the people, specifically to elect judges and other statewide executives. These positions had previously been appointments. Now, supporters of constitutional reform in Ohio rallied to the cause, not by citing the American Revolution or George Washington or their old enemy, the King of England. Instead, they celebrated the revolutions that they were reading about, especially revolutions in Eastern Europe in which people were rebelling against monarchs and empires and authoritarian governments. Ohioans found themselves in conversation with these populists in Eastern Europe and sought to connect their struggles against government of the select few, by the select few, for the select few. Ohioans in particular were quite taken with Louis Kossuth, who was the leader of the Hungarian revolt against the Austrian Empire in Eastern Europe. Kossuth is often called the father of Hungarian democracy, and sometimes the George Washington of Hungary. He toured the U.S. from 1851 to 1852 and spent a couple of weeks in Ohio, giving public speeches and raising money for the resistance effort. So taken were Ohioans that they named a town after him, Kossuth in Auglaize County in northwestern Ohio, and Cleveland even erected a statue to honor him, now located in University Circle. The popularity of Kossuth in Ohio tells us that Ohioans were paying attention to the rest of the world. In the 19th century, remember, technology had opened Ohio to the world at greater speeds and intensities than ever before. Ohioans tried to understand their struggle in the context of the struggles of people around the world. And these reformers, wherever their birthplace, whatever their native tongue, whatever their cause, they all tended toward the same language. Here's Article 1, Section 2 of the Ohio Constitution, ratified in 1851. All political power is inherent in the people. Government is instituted for their equal protection and benefit, and they have the right to alter, reform, or abolish the same whenever they may deem it necessary. And no special privileges of immunities shall ever be granted. And here's Louis Kossuth speaking in Columbus in 1852. The spirit of our age is democracy, all for the people and all by the people. Nothing about the people without the people. And here's Abraham Lincoln speaking in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in November of 1863. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The common theme here is people taking back power from the privileged, the insiders, the unchosen few. In the mid-19th century, we see Ohioans reaching beyond their parochial world of state constitutional reform. They became leaders in the attempt to reform the oppressive foundation of international capitalism. I'm talking here about the anti-slavery movement. Now let's consider the cotton industry for a moment. It was to the 19th century what the automobile industry was to the 20th century, arguably the most important industry in the world in its time. Why? Because it used the most advanced technology. It employed the most people, some 20 million workers worldwide, including 4 million slaves in the United States. And it touched nearly every continent and every consumer. There were two crucial places in the world of cotton. First, the American South. By 1860, U.S. slaves provided 75% of the world's cotton supply. And second, England. 20 to 25% of all jobs in England were related to the cotton industry. And approximately 50% of all British exports consisted of cotton yarn and cloth. So how does the world of cotton fit in with Ohioans and their reform spirit in the middle 19th century? Harriet Beecher Stowe became one of the most well-known Ohioans in the mid-19th century, not just in Ohio and not just in the United States, but in the world as well. Her criticism of slavery made her a best-selling novelist. Like most other Ohioans, she was born somewhere else, in Connecticut, and she migrated to Cincinnati. Her father was a minister who took a job there, and she met her husband, also a minister, in Cincinnati. Their first child died in 1832, a victim of the cholera outbreak. She and the family then left the city to escape the epidemic. She ended up in Kentucky, where she witnessed a slave auction for the first time. That experience jolted her. And when she met anti-slavery activist John Rankin, a white minister in nearby Ripley, Ohio, she slowly but surely became an abolitionist herself. Rankin's house was a stop along the Underground Railroad. Stowe listened to his stories and talked with fugitives as they came through Rankin's house. These experiences formed the basis of her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin dramatized the plight of slaves, not for a black audience, but for a white audience. It revealed to readers, very often for the first time, the horror of slavery, the horror of what goes into making the shirt that you love because it is so soft and comfortable. Slave owners regularly exploited women. Physical violence was a daily part of the slave experience, and the institution of slavery denied African Americans their God-given liberty. Stowe revealed to whites that blacks needed to be liberated. It also gave permission for whites to oppose slavery. Until Stowe, most abolitionists were considered on the fringe of advocating crazy ideas like black equality. Stowe showed whites the effect of slavery not just on blacks, but on whites too. Take, for example, the character of Simon Legree, the chief villain of the novel. Legree was a native Vermonter who moved to the South and became a plantation owner. Owning slaves changed him, forced him to regress, to devolve into an unrefined, violent, lustful person who cared only for profit. How could Ohioans hear that as anything but a warning to their own community? Ohioans profited from slavery too. It was only a matter of time before they all became Simon Legree. When it was published, Uncle Tom's Cabin outsold the Bible. They had to keep the printing presses open 24 hours a day. It's commonly called the first bestseller because there had been nothing like this in popular literature prior to Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it reached audiences in Europe as well. Translated into different languages, turned into a play, read in bars, people were entranced by Stowe's story, and they got access to it by whatever means possible. Here's how one American magazine publisher described the phenomenon. He said, "The Uncle Tom epidemic still rages with unabated virulence. No country is secure from its attack. The United States, Great Britain, and by the latest accounts Germany and France have yielded to its irresistible influence. No age or sex is spared. Men, women, and children all confess to its power. No condition is exempt. Lords and ladies, flunkies and kitchen maids are equally affected with the rage. The prevailing affection is universal, and all have the Uncle Tom." Note how he compares the spread of the book and its ideas to the spread of a disease. That's not an accident. Remember, when Uncle Tom's Cabin was first published, the world was just coming off a deadly outbreak of cholera. And notice, too, that the condition afflicts all classes. That's a testament to the pervasive presence of the cotton industry around the world. It touched nearly every continent and every consumer. So, based in Cincinnati, learning from the people she met there and the events she witnessed, Stowe wrote a globally significant book. It was so important that in the late 1850s, the Queen of England asked for an audience with Stowe. Stowe gladly accepted, but the Queen's advisor prohibited the Queen from meeting Stowe. Why? The economic power of the textile mills was too strong. Meeting with Stowe was tantamount to criticizing the most important industry in the nation. So the Queen instead arranged to be traveling down a London road on a certain day at a certain time in her carriage. And Stowe, by chance, would be traveling on the same road at the same day, at the same time, but in the opposite direction. When the two carriages met, they slowed, and the Queen subtly nodded her head toward Stowe and then continued on her journey. So why is Stowe's book important? At the very least, because it attacked, through words, the immoral, illiberal foundation of international capitalism. I mean slavery. But it also attacked international capitalism by first addressing the central problem of the pan-Mississippian world that Americans, and especially Cincinnatians, had built by the 1850s. And here I mean non-slaveholding whites and their complicity with slavery. When they sold food to a plantation owner, when they offered credit to a plantation owner, when they bought a shirt made from Mississippi cotton. But Stowe wasn't the only Cincinnatian to oppose slavery and the pan-Mississippian world in which the city operated. After all, Cincinnati was perhaps the most active anti-slavery city in the United States. So let's consider Salmon Chase. Like Stowe, Chase was originally from New England. He had migrated to Cincinnati to practice law. He was in Cincinnati at the same time as Stowe, that crucial decade of the 1830s. There, Chase witnessed a race riot and watched as a white mob destroyed the printing press of an abolitionist publisher. These anti-democratic, inhumane events convinced him that something was seriously wrong, not just in Cincinnati, but in the U.S. as well. Chase was a principled opponent of slavery, yet he was also an ambitious politician who understood the necessity of compromising to win elections. And he understood that abolition was a fringe issue, an issue that most whites would not support. So how could he make anti-slavery a respectable, winning political issue? First, Chase talked about law and order. Slavery had turned Ohioans into a vigilante mob when they had attacked the African Americans in 1836, and when they had attacked the abolitionist publisher and destroyed his printing press. The rule of law was at stake here, not black equality, not integration. The rights of whites were under attack. And so whites needed to reform their democratic system, to reinvigorate it. So when Chase looked around at the federal government, he saw an institution dominated by slaveholders. More often than not, a slaveholder had been elected to the presidency. And because the president appointed the Supreme Court justices, the Supreme Court was dominated either by slaveholders or by judges sympathetic to slaveholders. And Congress, too, had been thoroughly corrupted by slavery. In 1836, the House banned the reading and circulating of anti-slavery petitions, in effect undermining the right of Americans to petition their government. Chase and others call this the slave power conspiracy, the conspiracy of slave owners to enslave whites, to reduce their democratic system to a tool that served only the interest of the rich elite. And so Chase recommended that people take back their government, that they stand against the powerful slave owners. So the anti-slavery movement wasn't simply about liberating slaves. It was about liberating non-slaveholding whites from slave owners. So here's what Chase did. He turned the anti-slavery movement from a fringe movement dominated by zealots to a movement that most whites in Ohio could understand and recognize as useful. After all, Chase promised to liberate whites from the power of the privileged slave owners, from the power of the tyrants who had corrupted democracy. And like Stowe, Chase rejected the pan-Mississippian world. He argued that Ohioans and the rest of America should not sit quietly as slaveholders corrupted them, dangling the profit that non-slaveholding whites made from slavery. His audience was the steamboat captain who made money from hauling goods and people, including slaves, up and down the river, or the butcher in the slaughterhouse who prepared pork for consumption on the plantation, and even the farmer whose corn fed the pigs. Chase said that the slave power conspiracy had rigged the system. They had valued the reckless pursuit of profit over a democratic government. Ohioans were ready to hear the messages of Stowe and Chase because of changes in the state, changes that lessened the importance of the pan-Mississippian world. That's the focus of our next lecture.